able to return to. Um, yeah, I'm really happy to join you today because I think often the issue of disability in Palestine, which is very important, is often neglected or not discussed because there's a lot of issues that we need to discuss about what's happening in Palestine. But this is, in my view, one of the very important issues. So I'm very happy to be here and to be in discussion with Rayan and to be here with all of you tonight.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lina. And we'll now go to Dr. Ryan, please. Oh, Dr. Ryan. Sorry for my mispronunciation.
That's more than okay. I just want to let everyone know I'm joining you all from the lands of the Wiradjuri people in what we now call Central New South Wales. And I'd like to point out that the impact of ongoing colonisation in so-called Australia has drastically impacted deaf Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to the point where, unfortunately, some Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander sign languages have been either dismissed or even annihilated or under-acknowledged. My name is Dr Ryan Al-Natour. I come from the city of Ramallah, which is located in what we now call the West Bank. I have lived in Palestine as a teenager, and for the past 6 months, and now we're going on 7 months, just like every other Palestinian, my life has just been turned upside down. I began to make contact with deaf people across the Gaza Strip, which I'm happy to talk about tonight. And I'm hoping tonight that I can elevate their stories. And I will, of course, outline that, yes, I am a hearing Palestinian. Yes, I know a sign language. However, I'm not here to talk on behalf of deaf Palestinians, but rather I want to speak about their experiences of trauma, especially in the current climate of a genocide, which is dedicated to their erasure.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lina and Dr. Ryan, for introducing yourself. We'll now get into some of the questions of the night. Okay, I guess we'll start with, asking to Dr. Lina first. What are, through your work, what are some of the intersection between the disability, activist community that you have been involved with and continue to be involved with, and the liberation of Palestine now go, towards liberation? Sorry, Stan.
Thanks, Ethan. I just want to say that I'm joining you today, I forgot to say, from Ngunnawal and Ngambri land, from Canberra. And I also, of course, want to pay my respect to First Nations people of this land. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. I want to start my discussion today by stating some numbers and statistics. And I want to highlight a few things throughout the discussion that we have, and I'll start by giving a bit of context. So before October 7th, in the Gaza Strip, there was about 21% of households in Gaza that identified that they had a person living with disability in the household. But since October 7th and 1st of February this year, because we don't have more statistics from 1st of February, but from October 7th to the 1st of February this year, 1,000 Gazan children have lost a limb. So that's 10 children losing a limb a day. So this is just to give a picture of what situation we are dealing with. I want to highlight in my talk that when I speak about disability justice and disabilities in general, I'm talking about two different things. One is physical disability and the other one is mental disability. Because mental health is often disregarded, and people often, when they're thinking of disability, it's often the image of a wheelchair or something that is physically apparent. But the reason why this is very important in our discussion today is because systems that that cause genocide and colonization are systems that cause disabilities. And this is something that I will highlight over and over again in our discussion today. I wanna first talk about some of the definitions of the difference between disability justice and disability rights, which are disability justice is the term that we are using these days, which is a much more encompassing term that highlights intersectionality and connects disability to other forms of racialization, sexual minorities, other forms of oppression that intersects together to cause the situations that we are in today. So when we're talking about disability justice, in my view, we are often discussing since invalid 10, the 10, sorry, I'm just pulling it so I can read it to you. The 10 principles of disability justice. So 1 is intersectionality. 2 is leadership of those who are most impacted. 3 is anti-capitalism. 4 is cross-movement solidarity. 5 is wholeness. 6 is sustainability. 7 is cross-disability solidarity. 8 is interdependence. 9 is collective access. And 10 is collective liberation. So this kind of framework explains a vision of what we are imagining the world that we want to live in that is beyond just fighting for individual rights. I also want to say that when we are talking about disability, we often think that I'm an able person or I'm a disabled person as if it is it's a discourse of what is missing. But I want to highlight that disability justice theories have contributed to academic discussions throughout the years. One of the major contributions is the temporality of ability. The fact that if you might feel that you are able-bodied today, something might happen and you might lose that and you might become a disabled person at any moment, whether through an accident or through an experience. Therefore, disability studies have contributed to the fact, to us thinking about what is ability, and the fact that we have ability, is it continuous? It is not actually. That all of us might become disabled at some stage and then might gain ability at other stages. But it just highlights the fact that when we are thinking about disability, it is something that affects all of us and not just a small group of people that are having issues. It could be because a lot of times it's also, we're talking about elderly people. We are talking about someone who's had something that is temporarily or not. So it is disability justice as a framework includes all of these things and makes disability something that is interconnected between all of us, because my liberation is connected to your liberation. And if we don't fight for our liberation collectively, we don't want disability rights on an individual level. So I just wanted to make these few points, and I will come back in the next questions and highlight some of the other things.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lina, for that excellent reflection. I think in terms of the question of justice has been raised many times again, of course, within disability activism, because that notion that you spoke of, temporality, is actually quite important, because so many, I guess, the non-disabled, again, not so much non-disabled way of thinking, I guess, take for granted so much of the systems of the world that are built largely for, well, non-disabled people, but universal design, but also actually serves in so many ways to actually attain not only accessibility, but in a larger political form, justice for everyone. I guess touching on to that very point, since you mentioned Dr. Lina, but also Dr. Ryan, you're welcome to, of course, contribute to comment as well. Since you mentioned about the mental disabilities, which is in itself a form of invisible disability. Of course, there are, of course, visible expression of these disabilities, but can you expand more on that, and particularly in the context of Gaza and also Palestine, before, but also as after the 7th of October as well? Jason, is there...
I'm happy for you to continue, because you're on a really good explanation wave there that I'm keen to hear more from you about the topic.
Thank you, Ryan. Look, what I really want to say is that a lot of what we understand of disability is systematic. It is systems that makes us think about, simple things about whether you make this thing accessible or not, or there are structural issues that affect how we perceive the world that we live in. But what I want to highlight today, specifically in the context of Palestine, is that wars and armed conflicts are mass disabling on a mass scale. I grew up in Beirut during the war. The war ended in 1990s. I was 9.5 or 10 years old. And we grew up in shelters. We were children. We lived in the shelters, nearly other than becoming refugees several times, running away and coming back and running away and coming back, whether displaced internally or outside of the country. These experiences, it's very interesting because a lot of people who lived with us during that time did not, because everybody was affected by it, right? You hear fireworks and you have nightmares and you carry these things with you, and it doesn't just go away. It doesn't go away by itself. There's a fundamental thing that happens as a child when you are living in a world where some force that's outside of your understanding that can come and bomb you and remove you from this earth, kill your family, destroy where you live. I just want to bring this closer to people to understand the damage that armed conflict caused to communities and people in general. Everyone who we lived with and grew up with, everybody had PTSD. Everybody had depression. The generation of my parents that lived through it and had to carry us when we were toddlers and run around and hide from bombs. And this is something that even now, when we're feeling safe, the understanding of safety is something that you carry with you because you have no trust in the world. You can't have a trust in a universe where this is allowed. And this is what we are seeing in Gaza today. We watch the bombing every day. Every day we watch it on social media. We watch it live. We see it. And we can't do much about it. It just keeps going. It destroys people. And it scars them. Sometimes when I think about what's happening in Gaza, and our family just left Gaza 2 weeks ago, so we are relieved that they are safe now. But I just can't imagine, where do you start healing this? Where do you start telling these children that they can go home, or there's a world they can go back to, or like to make them trust the universe that we live in? It's just, this is why I think that talking about disability in that context is so important, because these systemic issues of wars are creating an impossible situation for people to function within a society and be okay. And the damage is not only physical, I read to you the statistics about the limbs and it's not just physical, it's something that everybody who lived in Gaza in the last, since October 7, but also everyone who lives in Palestine at the moment who experience the military, the weapons, they have to carry this with them. And it doesn't just go away. I'm just going to stop because I'm rambling.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Lina, for that very much powerful contribution. I guess now turning to Dr. Ryan, you of course mentioned that you are regularly in contact with the deaf community across Palestine. What are some of the unique, if that's applicable, experiences that deaf Palestinians have in a settler colonial context? Given that there are more than, of course, 15,000 deaf Palestinians, what are the languages that deaf Palestinians use?
So 6 months ago, when the horror began, after October 7th, maybe it was a day later, when both hearing and deaf societies, communities across the Gaza Strip knew what was coming. They knew that horror was on their doorstep because every couple of years, well before Hamas was created, the state of Israel has used any excuse to try and annihilate Palestinians, hearing and deaf. On that eve, I remember watching a Palestinian Sign Language interpreter who happened to be based in Qatar, who actually delivered a message to the deaf children in Gaza, to which he said, whatever happens, we will meet in heaven. And that is something that I don't think any sign language interpreter or anyone wants to tell deaf children across the Gaza Strip. In terms of numbers, there are 15,000 deaf people. The deaf community, which involves deaf people, deaf blind people, and hard of hearing people, are approximately 15,000. Across the West Bank, there are about 65,000. And the bit in between, or that I'll call 48 Palestine, there's about 5,000. And all of them have very, very unique experiences. Now, I could go on and talk about how deaf scholars have pointed out that deafness is a socio-cultural aspect, not just, and I know that societies frame deafness as a disability, but a lot of deaf people will remind you, as an example, that in deaf spaces, the disability isn't necessarily experienced. It might only be experienced if they come across someone who can't sign. So just as an example, tonight, we're privileged to have two interpreters. The interpreters, I would argue, are not here for the deaf viewers or deaf participants. They're here for the hearing participants because the vast majority of us are unable to sign. So that's just a dimension that I just want to, that's just something I wanted to point out in terms of the category of deafness as a disability and just the various interpretations of it. Now, I liked how Dr. Lina talked about intersectionality and the mental health aspect, especially with regards to disability, because most deaf people growing up in wealthy, privileged Western settler colonial contexts that have somewhat limited access to interpreters in this context might have an NDIS plan, which is definitely underfunded, but still have. They will still tell you that they grew up traumatized, not because of their deafness, but because of the autistic or the ableist barriers set up by the Hearing Society. And on that note, I'll explain the term autism. So autism basically refers to, this is a very, very simplistic definition. It refers to the discrimination experienced by deaf people in relation to their deafness. So it's ableism, but specifically in a deaf sort of context focus, if I can frame it that way. All Palestinians, all of us, we are orientalized by the settler colonial project, which is racist, which is unbearably genocidal. And deaf Palestinians, from what I've noticed, have a very, very unique experience of Zionism. So myself as a hearing Palestinian, I might experience Zionism as both colonization and racism. A deaf Palestinian would have their experience magnified to also include Zionism as autism. When you look at the idea of colonial control, we see that deaf Palestinians all over historical Palestine, and of course, I'm not including the deaf Palestinians in the diaspora, who are, of course, part of deaf Palestinian society. I'm only going to talk about those within historical Palestine. What we see is that deaf Palestinian communities are separated from one another. Now, deaf culture is, for some deaf communities, a very, very empowering part of their identity, of their existence. And for some deaf communities, deaf culture is about interactions, meeting spaces, being able to catch up. There might be occasions, festivals, parties, whatever, sport games or, theatres or whatever, specifically for deaf people, which the events might be in a particular sign language, or it could be like a reunion or a catch-up session. When you live in an apartheid system whereby you are separated by barriers, by checkpoints, by actual apartheid walls made of cement that need to come down, what you see is that deaf Palestinians are separated from one another in terms of their orientalized experience. So deaf Palestinians with Israeli citizenship are denied the opportunity to learn about deaf Palestinian history and even deaf Palestinian sign languages. Deaf Palestinians in Gaza are denied the opportunity to interact with deaf Palestinians with Israeli citizenship and deaf Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. Most of the schools, deaf schools that operate in both the West Bank and Gaza Strip are run by non-government organisations which do the basic minimum. And so the intersections between racism, ageism, and colonisation really, really do shine through. Not all deaf Palestinians are able to read and write in Arabic. Some only know Palestinian Sign Language. I think you asked me before, what are the sign languages that exist? There are many different dialects. So, of course, Palestine is only a third the size of Tasmania, but it has a lot of linguistic diversity within because of the nature of Zionism that separates deaf Palestinians from one another. And so there is Kufr Qasim Sign Language, which is based in what we call 48 Palestine, also Al Said Bedouin Sign Language. And there are, of course, various dialects of Palestinian sign languages. Unfortunately, because of the impact of colonisation, deaf communities have not been able to group together and create sign language dictionaries in the same way as they have been able to in other societies. So the level of colonisation and Zionism upon deaf Palestinians is just one that a lot of deaf people in other societies will not experience. And also, I did mention before that some deaf Palestinians in Gaza know how to read and write, some don't. Some deaf Palestinians have also been tortured by the Israeli military. So I think it was about November last year, a deaf man from Beit Lahia by the name of Ihab Tanbura was seen in a video filmed by the IDF, whereby they stripped his shirt, they tied his hands behind his back, and one soldier stepped on his head with a boot, and the other soldiers laughed and basically booted him in the head and in the stomach. Also, recently in the past fortnight, I've heard of deaf Palestinians and deaf-blind Palestinians at Al-Shifa Hospital who were tortured. One deaf-blind Palestinian who is completely deaf and completely blind, has no visual ability or hearing ability, was in a wheelchair and was thrown to the floor and kicked and was tortured as well. So it's these sorts of experiences that the West would never, ever... I doubt very much that the West would allow that to happen to deaf people in the West, or perhaps they would. But I'm pretty sure that if these were the experiences of deaf Israeli Zionists, the world would probably pay attention. But unfortunately, the miserable impact upon deaf Palestinians is one that the world is yet to recognize.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ryan. I guess just to follow up on that, because you also mentioned, of course, the intersectionality between colonization, colonialism, but also autism. You touch on the idea of, like, of course, the orientalization of Palestinians. Can you explain more about this concept? Sorry. Sorry, my voice is a bit weird. But can you explain more on this concept, please?
Sorry, what was the concept? I'm sorry, I didn't hear that part. Sorry.
I'll repeat my question. Sorry, my voice is just croaked out for a little bit.
Okay.
But you touched on the concept of orientalization of deaf Palestinians. Can you explain more on this and on this concept, and then the experience, of course, of that?
Okay, so in terms of the experiences of Orientalism among deaf Palestinians, they vary depending on whether they have Israeli citizenship or not. So deaf Palestinians with Israeli citizenship are forced to learn Israeli Sign Language, and the community sign languages like Kufr Qasim Sign Language are studied by Israeli linguists who bring along with them a very, very racist lens. And to deny an Indigenous person their right to study their ancestral sign language is indeed a form of colonial control. And as I mentioned before, deaf culture in Palestine is obstructed by Zionism because deaf Palestinians are either seen as a threat or in need of saving. Now, as I said before, deaf Palestinians with Israeli citizenship are forced to identify first and foremost as Arab Israeli, and even within deaf communities and large deaf Palestinian families, they are forced to learn a colonially imposed sign language system. When I've looked at the works of some Israeli linguists, and I'll be honest with you, it has made me cringe and just it's been unbearably disappointing. In some cases, Israeli linguists will say something like, very little is known about the sign languages that existed before, the European Jews came. But at the same time, they'll classify Israeli Sign Language, which was informed by Polish Sign Language and German Sign Language. They'll classify sign languages from Europe as being indigenous to Palestine. So they'll say this is the formation of indigenous Israeli Sign Language, whilst in the same sentence admitting that the sign languages actually came from Europe. And interestingly, when they study Kufr Qasim, as an example, when they study Kufr Qasim Sign Language, they will identify it as an indigenous sign language to the region, but the people that sign it are apparently not indigenous in that narrative. Also, the orientalization of deaf Palestinians is affirmed in the way that, as I mentioned before, that Zionists have criminalized deaf Palestinians, have tortured them in Israeli dungeons. So far, there have been at least 15 that I know of, or 16 deaf Palestinians who have been murdered. And there's an estimate within the community that there's about maybe 20 or 30 or possibly 40 under the rubble. The state of Israel likes to portray itself as a haven for deaf people. So it will boast that apparently there's a member of the Knesset who is a deaf woman who can sign. Their soldiers will sign the Israeli national anthem in their sign language. What they'll do is they'll employ deaf Zionists to participate in the military. And so while deaf Israeli soldiers are participating in the military, we have deaf Palestinians who have to not only dodge their bombs, but they're even being trolled across their social media accounts by deaf Israelis, being told things like, you will be deleted, you will be killed, you will be eliminated. So it's this sort of washing going on, some sort of, I'll call it just for now, autism washing, whereby the colony decides to portray itself as being indigenous, as being a wonderful haven for deaf culture, denying the existence in a colonial way of Palestinian sign languages and Palestinian deaf culture, portraying itself as being deaf-friendly whilst it oppresses and annihilates deaf people in the Gaza Strip. When Dr. Lina was talking before about amputations, I'd like everyone watching or listening right now to think about what an amputation of a deaf person's arm would mean for them in terms of their ability to communicate. How will they experience that trauma? And it's just and on top of the mental health trauma of constantly trying to look for food and shelter and access medical care. And so a lot, the trauma within deaf Palestinian communities in the Gaza Strip every day is compounded in so many different ways. And there is no compassion for deaf Palestinians by the Israeli military. Deaf Palestinians only get racism, autism, and torture. From a colonial project that is trying to erase them, not only in terms of their knowledge systems, in terms of the identities of different Palestinian sign languages, their existence, but just in terms of their presence within the Holy Land itself.
Dr. Ryan, of course, I think in your response, you mentioned the idea. You mentioned, of course, the idea of autism washing. We see a lot of parallels, of course, but other identity as well. The idea of like Israel as this safe haven, and then portraying Palestine as almost like a terra nullius, because that language has been used for almost just like a terra nullius. Same, very similar. We see parallels with pink washing, for example, in terms of trans identity and LGBTQ friendly, portraying Palestine as somehow hostile place for queer people, while Israel just the same, especially right now, to Palestinians. This question, I guess, goes to is for both Dr. Lina and also Dr. Ryan as well. How has the world allow these kind of washing and then identity, especially in the Western world, to be so prevalent? I guess Israel being able to use autism washing, but also pink washing to its political advantage, and how can we combat that not only as activists but also just as a broader community in order to push the cause of Palestine further?
Thank you, Ethan. I mean, I would like to direct people who are here today to a project called the Disability Visibility Project. The Disability Visibility Project is a blog that includes a lot of BIPOC people who write about disability, and there are a few posts on Palestine that are very powerful that I would suggest for people to read. But one of the blogs there states that everyone in Palestine is disabled. Because when we want to think about 360,000 cases of infectious disease from almost no water, no sanitation, when we have to think about people on wheelchair who have mobility issues that have to deal with the rubble on the streets that don't even exist, they can't move around. When we're thinking about access to equipment, access to medicine, neurodivergent people, navigating what's going on when there's no internet, when there's no interpretation, when there's no captions, when there's no Wi-Fi, being autistic and feeling overwhelmed by the constant noise, by the bombs. It's really interesting because that project has been attacked by Zionists, of course, because they are calling for a free Palestine and saying that Palestine is a disability issue. And the Zionist argument is that, do you think disabled people are treated better in Palestine? Disabled people have much better lives in Israel. And that's a very similar discussion to pinkwashing, right? That queer people have better lives in Israel and they are not treated well in Palestine. Well, yeah, when we can't, like, we have no right to live and be free and be liberated. A lot of things fall off the agenda, you know, like when you are trying to feed yourself and your family and try to find water and try to, even if you're not in Gaza, even if you are in West Bank, and try and negotiate how to cross the borders and access hospital. And just imagine for people of us who know here in Australia how difficult it is to access NDIS and how hard it is to get support. And just imagine all of these systems just crumbling and there's nothing there. Like, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about a population that is constantly in survival mode, constantly trying to do the absolute basic to survive day in, day out, and constantly being made disabled through the weapons are funded by our governments, from the United States government, from the Australian government. We are funding and supporting and exporting weapons that are killing and disabling Palestinians in Palestine. So we can't discuss Palestine without disability justice. Palestine is a disability issue, and disability is a Palestinian issue. There's no separation between the two, and there is definitely a narrative in the Zionist discourse to pink wash and disable wash and everything you want to wash so they can maintain an ethno-nationalist discussion about who is allowed to access these things and who is not even considered human.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Lina. I guess that your point is, of course, well, talking about and referring, talking about the amount of not only different identity washing is to try and elevate Israel as above Palestine and therefore allow to somehow subjugate people literally under military law in the West Bank, and then in other contexts as well, treating Palestine as not only second class but even lower than, especially we see statement by the Knesset and others that Dr. Ryan, for example, you mentioned earlier before as well. I guess you touched on that touched on a lot of, because I can see the ANU and Gaza encampment here. Welcome, hello ANU Gaza encampment. As many of us here, and this is more like, I guess, a little bit of a contribution from us as a Disabilities Collective as well, because we do have a University of Sydney encampment here as well. One of our goals at present is to try and target universities, at Sydney University, for example, to divest from Israel, but more particularly the weapon manufacturers, for example, Thales, Lockheed Martin. So I guess give that a shout out as well. I'll get a shout out because we do have a petition going on, but we'll push that in the end as well. I guess to the next question, and this is a question to both of you. I guess we've discussed this a lot already, but in terms of communications, how are the different disability community in Palestine that you are involved with or you're in regular contact with, of course, communicate to the world about the current genocide? I guess, how is this being communicated to the community? For example, through journalism by disabled, also non-disabled Palestinians, in not only here in so-called Australia, but also in the wider world. Yes.
Lina, did you? Okay, let me know, sister. Okay, so I just in terms of acknowledging everyone's efforts, I just want to quickly mention that Gallaudet, which is a deaf university in Turtle Island, or what we now call the United States, has done some amazing activism with regards to Palestine. There's student encampments there, but also that I want to point out that deaf people, global deaf people around the world, have actually, the past 6-7 months, made the effort to learn about Palestinian history, to learn about Palestinian culture, cuisine, and even to get in touch with the deaf community. What deaf and hearing people around the world have in common as witnesses to this genocide is that we've seen this disjuncture between what's on social media and what's fed to us by politicians and the news. And that's made a lot of people very, very angry. And so as a result, in terms of accessing, and I'm sorry, because unlike Lina, I'm only going to focus on deaf communities, if that's okay. So in terms of deaf communities across Gaza, electronic devices are really, really important at a time of genocide and crisis in terms of relaying information. And when you have an apartheid colonial state that decides to restrict electricity, restrict water, restrict, basic services, that negatively impacts deaf communities. What I've seen take place specifically in Gaza is that coders have actually stepped up at a time of trauma. Now, I'll just briefly talk to you, I'll briefly describe what is a coder. So coder is an acronym. It stands for child of deaf adult. And so children in Gaza as young as 5 with deaf parents have had the responsibility to accompany their parents in emergency rooms, have had to take on these responsibilities of filming themselves and speaking in Arabic whilst signing in Palestinian Sign Language simultaneously, explaining their parents' circumstances. So one coder, young female in particular that I'm thinking of, is a girl by the name of Mayar, Mayar. And she has now developed an Instagram following whereby she's constantly being the voice for her parents, explaining their circumstances. But I just want to point out something as well. A lot of qualified interpreters within the Australian context, when they work in emergency rooms, they have to have a certain skill level. So I myself, even though I can communicate in Auslan, I am not qualified or equipped to be in an emergency situation. If I decided to volunteer, I would be understandably disbarred, or what's the word? I would be legal action would be taken against me or anyone else who's not qualified, and rightly so. But unfortunately, within the Gaza context, we're seeing children are taking on these enormously difficult and stressful situations that is not fair to them, and it's not fair to Palestinian deaf communities within that context. So social media has been the major vehicle by which deaf Palestinians have seen support from the global deaf community. So in particular, Instagram, which is probably more video friendly, if I can call it that, whereby almost daily, deaf Palestinians are vlogging their experiences. Very few might know International Sign or American Sign Language, but most obviously know Palestinian Sign Languages. So it's this experience at the moment that is part of the deaf Palestinian experience in Gaza, reaching out to the world, vlogging constantly, and making connections with the world's deaf population, explaining their circumstances, the horrors, their starvation. And the other thing I want to mention as well is that over the past 7 months, I've seen so many deaf Palestinians that I've gotten to know get skinnier and skinnier due to lack of food, lack of medical care, lack of, nutrition. And it's just unbearably worrying and frightening for all of us in the Palestinian diaspora.
Ryan, I guess now we're going to go into questions with regards to taking a look at of course, the current activism going on within not only here in so-called Australia, but also throughout the world as well. And then looking at touching on based on the steps that Dr. Lina earlier said, leading towards collective liberation for all. I guess of course, there is an increasingly powerful movements we see, at least within the past 2 weeks right now. Of course, it's been going for many months right now due to the ongoing genocide. But it's increasingly powerful. We see it in the US, we have encampments, and in Australia here, we have encampments on the University. Also, of course, we see the ANU Gaza encampment. Once again, thank you for joining. And springing up around major university sites around the world. How should students, staff, but also the public continue to campaign to help uplift the voices of not only disabled Palestinian, but on the whole of Palestinian history, but also liberation as well?
Thanks, Ethan. I want to just say that colonialism makes us sick. Colonialism affects us physically, mentally. The fact that that my grandfather was not allowed to be buried in his land, the fact that his kids, my mum, my uncles cannot be buried on their lands, the fact that we can't access the herbs, the medicinal plants, the flowers, the food that we grow traditionally. Colonialism, I'm gonna start to answer your question is to first understand the deep connection that Palestinians have and solidarity with First Nations people on the land that we are on today, where we are all joining. Because we understand what it means when your land is taken, when your land is stolen, when your land is being abused, you are also sick. When you are disconnected from your land, you are unwell. Colonization makes us unwell. The discussions about closing the gap and why Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people die younger, are more sick, it's because of that. Because colonial governments, in the way they interact with Indigenous people, makes them sick. This is how colonialism works. We know what it means. We Palestinians know what that means. So at the start of our activism and everything that we do on this stolen land, we stand very strongly in solidarity with our First Nations siblings, because their liberation is our liberation. There is no activism for Palestine if there is no activism in support and with and behind and standing by First Nations people on this land. And all the activism that has been happening on this land have been with the support of First Nations people. Without them, we cannot do anything. So if you are an activist and you want to support Palestine, you have to first understand that Palestine is not an issue only in physical Palestine on the map just there. The problem that is going on in Palestine happened here. Colonialism is not just there, it is also here. So if you want to understand what's going on in Palestine, you have to understand what's going on here. And if you want to understand what's going on here, you have to understand what's going on in Palestine. So I just want to highlight the importance of the role colonialism plays in destroying our bodies and destroying our souls, and in separating the people from the land that they can't access, by destroying the lands that they are on, by separating them from their own land. This is the core of what we are calling for liberation. And once we understand that, then we will start understanding that colonialism is the cause of disability in many, many places and for many, many situations. Because we don't need to talk about disability if we are all free standing together, if we are all liberated together.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Lina. That was I guess, excellent, I guess, encapsulation of what, well, many of our campers are doing, but also should be striving more and striving ever increasingly towards as well, because of course we hear constant reports of racism within so-called Australia right now, that it's infuriating. It should be infuriating to our politicians, but then also the government, seemingly after the referendum, have not only done much, but in many ways, I like to, I guess, pay attention to this, made stepping backwards. For example, I remember in Queensland, in New South Wales, tougher bail laws, and it is these systems that we otherwise think are seemingly legal, seemingly administrative. They are very harmful. They are deeply harmful, and deeply, in a sense, further inflicts and further disabling to our communities as well. Not only collectively, but especially disadvantages not only First Nations, but yeah, many within the entire community. I guess one other question that we have, touching base on what Dr. Lina just said, is how are the disability justice, I guess, activists from communities that you are involved in? For example, Dr. Ryan, you're excellently in touch with the deaf community. How are they campaigning for Palestine right now? And yeah.
I'll just answer that quickly. So within 2 weeks of the genocide starting, I was fortunate enough to be invited to a deaf Zoom meeting whereby various deaf Palestinians and their allies got together and talked about the needs that, what we could do. And accessibility was definitely a theme. But also what we did was we also started an initiative which is led by deaf Palestinians on Instagram, and it's called Access Palestine. Access Palestine provides information about what is happening across Gaza, across Palestine, in different sign languages. So Auslan, BSL, and also the vast majority are ASL or international sign videos. And the other thing is, in terms of what we could do, is the raising of, in the case that I'm talking about, deaf Palestinian voices, raise their perspectives, uplift them. Let's not treat them like a novelty. Let's not tokenize them. They are not feel-good opportunities for a hearing community that wants to feel good about their compassion, but rather deafness is a beautiful thing. Sign languages are amazing. I wish more people were able to communicate in them. I would love, for me, a free Palestine is a place of disability justice where the barriers of autism are completely broken down, whereby Palestinian sign languages are embraced and accessible in every space within a free Palestine. It's, a place whereby the barriers facing deaf people, which are not natural, they're actually built by the hearing community so they maintain control. They come from a place of white colonial, able-bodied, heteronormative, autistic patriarchy. I know that was a mouthful, but it's just one way of summarizing it. So, yeah, so it's about recognizing who we are and making sure that we mainstream disability justice rather than treat it as a novelty, rather than treat it as a feel-good opportunity. So, just even having events, information about Palestine, the idea that deaf people should worry about whether it's accessible. If non-deaf people or hearing people actually took on the roles and responsibilities and said, don't you worry, we're actually going to work with you and make sure that this event is accessible and appropriate. It's about realizing that the experiences of Palestinians are diverse based on ability. And it's about seeing our freedom in relation to making sure that the barriers of autism and ableism are destroyed. Because every single Palestinian that I know, when we talk about freeing Palestine, we always say that once we return, we will have a lot of work to do. It is not just a matter of us relaxing. I'm surely going to go back to Ramallah. Dr. Lina will go to Jaffa. She's more than welcome to come visit me in Ramallah and vice versa. But at the same time, we're going to have a lot of work to do with regards to freeing Palestine, because it's not just about the Israeli hegemony, the Zionist sort of colonial project. It's about its after effects, the mental health impacts that have taken a toll upon the deaf community across Gaza will not disappear once there is a ceasefire. There will still be, unfortunately, starvation, a lack of interpreting services, a lack of access to health services, healthcare, and even education. So the work needs to be done. And I think I'll just remind everyone that, yeah, it is there, and we all have a part to do. We all have a part to play, I should say.
Dr. Ryan, I guess now before we go to Q&A, I'd like to have a quick, I guess, final question. What is your message? I mean, Dr. Lina touched on this earlier as well, but what is your message to the students and staff, everyone, of course, who are here on Zoom, also here in person, who are involved in the campaign at the moment? What's your message to them?
Thanks, Ethan. I just want to shout out to all my friends and family at the ANU encampment. Thank you all for being there and for all the students who are on every encampment on the stolen land. To be honest, I have been struggling being in academia for a long time because of how awful academic institutions have become. And sometimes you ask yourself, are we here to educate and research? Are we here for knowledge, or are we here to satisfy stakeholders and funders and private companies? But what's happening on our campuses in the last few weeks gives me a lot of hope and reminds me and all of us of why universities are places for learning. This is why we should stay on these campuses. Having people sit there and saying, this not in our name, not on our name, stop funding these companies. We don't want our degrees to be funded by weapons manufacturing. We need you to divest, cut connections, free Palestine. Having the Palestinian flag in the middle of every campus is really giving not just me, but all of us a hope. I don't know if you've seen, there's a really beautiful video this morning of children in Gaza sending solidarity messages to all the students in encampments and just telling them, because the worst thing that you feel when you are being bombed is that you are alone and nobody cares. That's the worst feeling in the world, that you are being killed and nobody cares about you. And what has been happening on our campuses and around these stolen lands has been really inspiring. The weekly rallies, the seminars, the discussions, the movement, and now the encampments, they are really, this will be written in history that people have rejected this and we say no to that. And we're going to fight. We should all fight together and stand together to ask universities, you are not to invest. Our public universities are public education institutions. They should not be investing and developing nuclear weapons and weapons manufacturing to help defense. This is not what public education should be about. If we are here, we need to make sure that our institutions divest, disclose and divest at ANU campus and on every campus on the stolen land.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lina. That was really, I guess, a strong message that I guess everyone in this room have heard. And also, we should carry on that as we, of course, we are at our respective encampment as well. I see Andy on here. Again, also at usage to push this further. I guess now we are we're going to, just in the interest of time as well, we're going to a short 10 minutes or so Q&A. So if anyone wants to have a question, please either raise your hand in the room or on Zoom just by raising your hand using the yellow little button, and we'll take your questions. Or just type in Zoom, either way.
Movement is connect, but with that, it will, you liquid.
I'll basically create like a kind of speaking list kind of thing. I see we have a question from Victor. For those in the room, we'll be using this little speaker thing so that everyone can hear.
Yeah. I just want to say a massive thank you to our panelists. It was a fantastic contributions by both of you. I think so. Hello. Sorry. Yeah. Well, my question is, I think Dr. Ryan touched on this briefly about the effects of the carceral system on activists or even just people with disabilities. I think to make a bit of a contribution here in Sydney, some of us over the past couple of months we've done actions down at Port Botany in an effort to blockade Israeli ships that have come. We don't know what the exact contents of the ships are. Not even the dock workers know, but we do know that Australia engages in bilateral arms trade with Israel. So we have seen it as our duty to be down at the ports wherever we can. And as part of that, what the Legal Observer team has noted is that several of the arrestees have disabilities, and the response from the police here has been absolutely horrific, in that they believed that these people were faking their disability, and they basically, they put them into these cells, they subject them into the horrific conditions of the Surrey Hills police station, and they just refuse to believe that these people have disabilities, they may need to get medication and so on. So I was wondering if either of you could touch on, to expand a bit about what, to elevate some of the voices that you've heard in terms of, especially right now it's very topical on the effects of the carceral system and the prison system in repressing the rights and voices of not just Palestinians, but all activists across the world.
Okay, in terms of the carceral system with regards to deaf Palestinians, we see that it's echoed in the colony of Israel, whereby their prison systems operate as dungeons, as torture chambers for hearing and deaf Palestinians. As an example, when a deaf person has their hands tied behind their back, they are unable to communicate. And there's a specific trauma that is experienced in relation to that, taking away someone's ability to communicate. I do know of in Naarm, there have been several deaf communities that have been involved in protest actions and have experienced excessive violence from the police. And I suppose, and as that person was asking their question, in the back of my mind, I was thinking ACAB, which, really, really does hit home here. So I think I think there needs to be a system whereby where participants report ableism and autism as it operates within the police force, which in itself is an extremely violent institution. But I think that those stories need to come out more and need to be publicised to the best of their ability, need to be shared across social media. Unfortunately, right now, for Palestinians and our allies, the media and politicians are not our friends, but social media is making a huge impact. And so spreading that awareness, sharing those stories needs to become so common. So I think that should definitely be a starting point.
Thank you, Victor, for that question. That's a very important question, and it's one of the points that I had written down, but I haven't touched on yet. I believe that disability justice is an abolitionist movement. I believe that I would suggest for people who are interested to read Decarcerating Disability. This is a book written by Liat Ben Moshe, who is a very important book that connects how abolishing mental institutions is highly connected to abolishing prisons. And the author of that book talks about the social change of how decarcerating disability, basically, how mental institutions where people with mental disabilities used to be locked in rooms and treated as prisoners has become in a very short period of time unacceptable. And therefore, mental health institutions are currently not acceptable. But the author makes the parallel between how society moved from thinking that people who are mentally unwell should go into mental institutions to very quickly learning that this is not okay and that this is not acceptable. And Ben Moshe links that to how we need to understand prisons and how we can apply abolition. Because often we think abolition is something that we could dream about. It's not practical, but actually abolishing prisons is a very practical thing that we could do. And it is not impossible. It is actually very possible in our lifetimes. Because just think about it. Who is managing the prisons? It's the state. The state is deciding who should be imprisoned and who should be not, who is incarcerated and who is not. Who gives the state the power to make these decisions? And knowing what states do, why do we give them that power to incarcerate people? So I think linking abolition to Palestine, to disability is a very important link, and that these three concepts are very strongly connected. And we see that when we see what the Israeli state is doing to Palestinian political thinkers, to politicians, to poets, to writers, imprisoning them indefinitely and punishing them for speaking out, using prisons as a system of oppression. Prisons are systems of oppression. And we need, as a society, to start thinking, how do we want to live in a place where prisons are not acceptable? Because instead of funding more prisons, we need to put this money in community. We need to look after each other, make sure that we have housing, that we have food, that we can support each other, that people have access for them to be okay, to be able to function as much as they can in the society that we live in. So abolition, in my view, is very central to this discussion. And when we are discussing colonialism and Palestine and the Israeli state, we also need to think about the Australian state and why prisons were started here. Historically, prisons were started in the colony to discipline First Nations people, to control First Nations people. So yes, abolition is very central, in my view, to this discussion, and very, very important.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lina and Dr. Ryan. I think we have time for just one more question, and then we'll go to we'll have two donations, but we'll go. Does anyone else want to have a question? Yeah, one more question, including anyone on the Zoom as well. This is your chance to ask.
We don't have questions to just want to do closing statements.
Yeah. Okay. I guess in that case, then we'll, if anyone else doesn't have any question right now, then we'll go to. I'm just gonna go to. For those on the Zoom, I'll just now share screen as well. Give me just one quick second. Okay. On the screen right now, there should be a link. Just scan the QR code. I'm just going to explain this. So we are working, of course, today with Donation Deaf Gaza, which is a group of basically donating towards the deaf community in Gaza. So if you can scan the QR code and donate however you can in your capacity, then that would be brilliant. The SRC, of course, from Disco, we will be.
Well, I'm just going to ask if you can circulate the links that are
Yes. I can circulate them.
Thanks so much.
But for those on online, but also on Zoom, takes some time, just a little bit. I'll leave about 1 minute so that we can check the link.
Can I just jump in, Ethan, and just say a few things about the protest and the movement? I just want to call on everyone who is involved in the Palestine liberation movement on these stolen lands to check in on your disabled siblings, check in what they need, have Auslan interpreters. This is the absolute minimum. Every event we do should have a safe space, calm space where people can go and retreat if they feel overwhelmed. There are very small things that we could do to make our spaces and our movement more accessible. Because if we are having a movement that excludes disabled people, we are failing. There is no movement without people with disability. We have to do this together. So please, if there's anything you take out of today's conversation, I encourage everyone to have a think in every event that you organize. Just give it 15 minutes at the beginning and say, what have we missed? How can we make sure that everyone can access this event? and access it comfortably. And if you're not sure, ask people with disability. But also there's a lot of resources online, so there's really no excuse for not doing it. Yeah, I mean, I can see already in protests in Naarm, there's always an Auslan interpreter. We need to make sure that this happens in every state, in everything that has to do with Palestine. There needs to be interpreters and accessibility thinking that we think about all our siblings around us.
And just on that note, with regards to interpreters, I'm really, really grateful for a lot of people within the deaf community here in so-called Australia that have used their personal NDIS funds to fund interpreters. Information should be accessible within institutions. And so I know that, and unfortunately, a lot of organisations take credit for a deaf person using their NDIS. They use this as an opportunity to say, isn't it wonderful we had an interpreter here, even though it came out of someone else's NDIS funds, which were probably limited as they were. So with regards to accessibility, let's see what we can do in terms of institutions, because I really believe that educational institutions in particular have a responsibility to make sure accessibility is normalized. And I'll also just quickly as well, there is another GoFundMe for the deaf community in northern Gaza as well, and I hope that was okay. I'll publish that in the chat as well. So if people can, if anyone donates, can it be equally distributed? I'd appreciate it. I'm sorry to throw that at you. I just in recent times, I think it was the day before yesterday, I had a deaf Palestinian in Gaza send me the link. So I've just passed it on in the chat group, if that's okay.
Yep, that's perfectly okay. For those on the chat, I'll just now copy that so that I have a copy of this so that later on when I go back, I'll post it on the main event link as well so that it's possible for everyone, because in the room, but also everyone else. Sorry, I know everyone's probably seeing this. Cool. Okay. I guess that. I guess that's with that we pretty much wrap up the discussion today. Thank you once again very much to Dr. Lina, Dr. Ryan, but also to the excellent interpretation work of Beck and Tanya as well. Thank you so much for taking your time here today. Thank you for everyone on the Zoom, to Leah, to Remy, Tamara, Spario, but also to the ANU Gaza encampment. Thank you so much for coming, and I guess in solidarity. It's really strange because we're in one encampment here, over there, and we're here. Of course, to everyone in the room as well. I'm seeing you guys are kind of invincible. I know it's invincible to those on Zoom right now, but there are people here as well. They're waving hello, and yeah. Thank you so much, everyone. In terms of the resources on the Zoom right here, for example, links to Access Palestine, but also to decarcerating disability that Dr. Lina mentioned, we'll process this and then put it, I guess, into like a joint, like a bigger post on the event so that everyone have access to them when we get home. And yes, thank you everyone for coming. And for those who are either on Zoom, wherever you are, but also particularly in the room right here, we'll go back to the Sydney encampment right now for further discussion and just hang around as well. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.